You're listening to The Sacred Sofa, a podcast that explores all things theology and therapy. My name is Grace Brown. I'm a registered psychotherapist, certified Canadian counselor, and owner of Journey with Grace Counseling Services.
And I'm Brad Watson, pastor of Nexus Church and author of the book, A Path Called Compelling. Welcome to The Sacred Sofa. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to The Sacred Sofa. This fall, Grace and I have been exploring the 7 great plot lines of story and how that impacts our narrative selves. So I'm glad to be back at it. This is 6 of 7 this morning. Welcome to you, Grace.
Hey, Brad. It's always a great time to be with you and to explore such very intriguing topics that we've been talking about, these 7 storylines. And so let's get after it. It's always a pleasure. And I was thinking this week as we were getting ready to talk about this most recent storyline of tragedy. But I was thinking sometimes we only think of things that are tragic after they fall apart.
Right.
And so it's easy to name tragedy in hindsight, but I think it can be even harder when we're still living in it. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And, that's kind of where we want to go today. We're talking about the tragedy plot line, and not just the kind that happens to us, but the kind that we quietly write for ourselves. So it's the tragedy idea is not ones that are born of, say, circumstance, but tragedy because of ego, obsession, pride, avoidance. In other words, you could say it's the tragedies we write for ourselves or choose. And so I think it's a good place to start distinguishing 2 kinds of tragedy, right? So there's natural tragedy, the sort that strikes from outside of us. It could be disease, disaster, loss, whatever it is. And of course, that just calls for compassion and lament. But then there's what we're talking about with the tragic plot line is self-inflicted tragedy, where our strengths become our undoing. So scripture has tons of these stories. Shakespeare loved to write stories. The Greeks had their tragedies. And it's usually about someone, a protagonist, who begins heroic and ends up hollow. So in these stories, we watch how the very thing that once made someone admirable, it could be their ambition or, say, charisma, intelligence, it slowly becomes the source of their ruin, right? So it's the tragedy we court, the one we think we're immune to. So scripturally, King David is a great example, right? His story starts so triumphalist, right? He's the underdog who slays Goliath. Eventually, when he becomes king, the hero ends up turning into a bit of the villain. His strength curdles into self-destruction. So it all starts really with Bathsheba and Uriah, family chaos, rebellion of his son Absalom. It's all fallout from one moment of unchecked desire. And I think David's story reminds us that even the people we still look at from thousands of years ago who are spiritual giants, they're not safe from themselves. And what makes it tragic isn't just what happens to him, it's that he loses complete sight of who he once was. So, Grace, here's what I keep thinking. We so often talk about, you and I, we talk about resilience a lot of times on the show, but maybe tragedy, right? It starts not in weakness, but a lot of times I think it starts in overconfidence. So I'm curious, where do you see maybe, say, a fine line between healthy confidence and the kind of pride that isolates us? Is this something that you can speak to?
Yeah, I think it's true. Healthy confidence in my mind, and even pride, healthy pride, I think is a combination of not only understanding our values, the gifts that we've been given and are passionate about sharing with others. I think it's also being humble and vulnerable. Unhealthy pride, and the opposite, is self-serving and arrogant. It's always about self and not about the greater good.
Right. And I think this is one of the first calls of the tragic storyline, is to, examine our strengths. Because I know in my life, for instance, I'm always sort of worried about the areas where I'm weak. Oh, I'm not good at this or that. And that can be kind of my focus of, I hope I don't get myself in trouble. But strengths can be an area that can be our downfall. So why, Grace, do you think it's so hard for people to recognize maybe when their strengths are beginning to sabotage them?
hmm I think, it's something you just said and something you spoke to a bit in our earlier episodes
Mm,
that an unrecognized strength can be a double weakness, right?
mm,
If you're not
mhm,
paying attention, you're going to miss it. And I think this happens in small ways and then even bigger ways.
mm,
Sometimes it's a slow and steady decline.
mm,
I identified healthy versus unhealthy pride. And in unhealthy pride, that leaves the blind spots and keeps us open and vulnerable to falling on our faces.
mm, mhm,
And so, for example, lack of boundaries can make for a slow and steady slide.
mm,
I'm going to give an example in the work professional realm. Okay.
mhm.
So recently I've been reading online about this growing trend that people are calling grind set.
Okay.
And so in this article, some wealthy CEOs and entrepreneurs, they're actually starting to encourage young people who are dreaming about owning their own business to get rid of the idea that there is no work-life balance. So I'm
Hmm.
already saying red flag,
Mm, yeah, red flag. Yeah, for sure.
right? And they're saying to these young people that if you're not grinding it out 60 or more hours a week, then you're never going to be successful.
Oh boy.
Yeah, uh-huh, uh-huh.
Uh-huh.
And so, if a person actually buys into this idea of grind set to be successful, then they're not actually going to allow for healthy boundaries on their time, which steadily over time will lead to, at the very least, burnout. And
Mm,
at the greater, the risk there's a relationship loss, there is going
mm,
to be physical and mental health conditions and ramifications, right?
mm,
And it starts in small ways. So every time you work through your lunch,
mm,
every time you don't utilize your personal time off, every time you work outside of your designated work hours, you increase your risk. You increase
right.
your risk. And what can begin as a high work ethic or standards or expectations for yourself in business now is hyper productivity and
Mm,
now puts yourself and your relationships at risk.
mm. That is fascinating, Grace. I have not heard of grindset until you
Mm,
mentioned that there. That is interesting, and I like the way you frame that, right? Because again, it can be the pursuit of say, hey, of course I want to be successful. I want my business to grow. Well, what's the
mm-hmm,
cost of that? So you might find success, but where could also be
mm-hmm,
your downfall. And I think that's the strange insight of the tragic plot line is that our
mm-hmm,
downfall rarely comes from our weakness. It comes from what we're best at. And when that gift becomes unexamined or
mm-hmm.
unrestrained, that's the problem. So ambition without humility becomes obsession. Love without wisdom can be turned into jealousy, and strength without surrender can turn into control, right?
Ah, that's good. That's good. I like that. I like that.
Yeah, and Christopher Booker, he calls this the shadow of the hero. When the
Hmm.
shadow of the hero emerges and starts taking over the plot line, that's when trouble happens. And it's in every tragic story, right? All the way back from Macbeth, with Shakespeare to
Mm-hmm.
like even we've had some recent good tragic storylines. Oppenheimer is a recent example, right? A
Right, right.
brilliant mind creates the atomic bomb, but it also unleashes hell.
Mm,
And the end of the movie, if you've seen it, he ends up kind of alone, and there's a tragic part there. Walter
mm-hmm.
White from Breaking Bad is a great example, just a classic fall. And all of these storylines, they kind of whisper the same warning to the viewer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What we refuse to humble will one day humble us.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Absolutely.
so great. When you work with clients, how do you help them notice when something that might be beautiful in them, a strength even, has started to turn maybe toxic?
Mm-hmm. So one strong indicator that something beautiful is turning toxic is often the impact it's having on the person,
Mm,
the
hmm.
impact that behavior has having. So here's an actual example I actually use with clients. Okay,
Okay.
so you and
Yeah.
I are going to be a part of this example.
Okay.
So you're a dog lover, right? Like I know.
Well, I have a dog.
Okay.
Yes.
So I know there's some angstiness with your
Yeah.
dog,
Yes,
but
that's right. That's
for the
right.
sake of this hypothetical,
Okay. I love
situation.
dogs. I love dogs. Yes.
All right, so we're dog lovers. Say you and I are going for a walk and we see a dog.
Mm.
And as we get closer to the dog, we notice that the dog is in distress.
Mm,
Say, as dog lovers, we're going to have compassion for the dog, right?
right.
Compassion and kindness is our superpower.
Right.
Okay. And from that, we're going to want to help the dog, right? But
Mm-hmm.
wisdom has to be married with that compassion and kindness, or we put ourselves at risk. You don't know
Ah,
the dog, you don't
right.
know the impact of the distress, but
Mm,
to not marry wisdom with that, we are going to put ourselves at risk and maybe
right.
even potentially harm the dog in the end because we're going
Mm,
in there without knowledge. And like every superhero, we need to learn to harness our strength or we risk harm to ourselves and harm to
mm,
others.
mm. I
And
like that.
so,
That's a
see
great
how the
analogy.
beauty of compassion and kindness, that's
Mm,
not the problem, is how
yeah.
we wield that, is whether
Mm-hmm.
it becomes a toxic situation.
Yeah. Yeah. You can easily see how you get yourself bit if you're not
Mm-hmm.
exercising wisdom along with the compassion. Um, Now, the nature of these tragedies, Grace, is that they often are because we've ignored certain problems. Now,
Mm.
I just part of the reason, Grace, that we were off last week, I'll own it. It was because of my end here, because I had a basement tragedy, Grace. It was everything fell apart at home at once for me here. All of these things I've
Mm.
been neglecting in the basement. So, all in one go, my gas pipes, my water heater, my furnace
Mm.
all
Mm.
decided to, yeah, oh, not good. Not good, Grace.
I mean, this is tragedy
Yeah,
because none of those
yeah.
things are like minor or cheap.
No,
So I
no,
am
no, they
feeling
are
for
not.
you, my
Yeah.
friend.
Yes, yes. But it was such a great reminder to me, right? Like in some ways, some of the stuff needed to be upgraded. It had to be done. But in other ways, it was very much the things I ignore because I don't like dealing with house stuff, right? Sort of put
Mm.
it off, put it off, put it off. And then what you find is eventually you ignore problems, put it off too long, it will force itself on you at some
Mm.
point, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing about the tragedy plot line is it reminds us all the time that tragedy doesn't arrive suddenly. It
Mm.
always accumulates. It's built out of the small things that we ignore. And
Mm-hmm.
I think we all get this to a certain degree, right? Like in a relationship, there's an unspoken tension, and it's easier to just, oh, I'm going to ignore that, or
Mm.
unresolved conflict, or maybe the little compromises that start to harden our hearts. All of those
Mm.
things, it's neglect becomes the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And I once an old friend of mine, pastor, he used to say, no one wakes up one morning deciding today's the day I'm going to destroy my marriage, or today's the
Mm.
day I'm going to destroy my faith or my peace of mind. It builds, it accumulates, it happens one avoidance at a time. And so leaks start small, but then suddenly, like in my basement, the whole system fails, right?
Oh.
So
Mm-hmm.
what are some of the everyday ways do you think that we ignore sort of small leaks, as it were, in our emotional lives, things that seem harmless but
Mm-hmm.
corrode us over
Mm-hmm.
time? Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And you mentioned a few just now, especially in terms of relationship. Ongoing feelings of irritation and annoyance are
Mm,
always indicators of boundary violations.
mm-hmm,
And we ignore them to the risk
mm,
leading to resentment and then even outbursts of anger,
right.
right? Passive communication rather than assertive communication often leads to misunderstanding and then even greater conflict.
Mm, mm-hmm,
Lack of healthy boundaries and self care, leading to burnout and a holistic lack of well being. Checking out. Checking
mm,
out, withdrawing from social community leads to more in isolation and increased loneliness. And of
right.
course, even to a greater degree, unhealed trauma, leading to increasingly intense mental health breakdowns. Unaddressed generational trauma leads to more trauma and abuse. We've
Mm,
talked about this in previous episodes. And
yeah.
so there are always warning signs and even
Mm,
red flags, and we
yeah.
choose to ignore them at our own risk, at
Mm.
their own and the risk of relationship. Absolutely.
Well, you actually just hit on something that I think is quite interesting here in terms of the plot line itself. So, Christopher Booker, again, the guy who authored this idea that all great stories are seven plot lines. What he points out about tragedy is interesting. They all end the same way, he says, and that's
Mm,
in isolation. So, there's obviously story and drama, but the lead character becomes more and more isolated over time. So,
mm,
some of the, again, Breaking Bad, Walter White, he ends up dying alone, isolated. King David, right? Like his life ends. He's kind of grieving alone in a dark room. It's a really sad, pathetic scene.
mm,
Macbeth in Shakespeare is surrounded by the ghosts of his own making. And so, isolation seems to be a real big, it's both a symptom of tragedy and also a
mm-hmm.
warning sign. Like, hey, the more isolated I am, maybe that's a red flag for us to pay attention to. So when we stop listening, stop confessing, stop trusting, the story's already turning tragic.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking, even just reflecting on this, but the sort of things that we say to ourselves, like, I don't need help, right? Again, that's a
Mm-hmm.
bit of an isolating, I can do this on my own, or no one
Mm-hmm.
gets me, no one understands me, everyone else is wrong, right? I
Mm-hmm.
sometimes come across people, they're like, oh, this relationship didn't work, boop, 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 this one. And at a certain point, you go, have you ever stopped and wondered if maybe you're part of the
What
problem,
is the
right?
common
Like, what, yeah,
denominator?
yeah, exactly, right? And so the circle can close really quickly, and tragedy starts not with a fall, but withdrawal. So,
Mm-hmm.
but this is one of those tricky ones, Grace, because we all need some healthy solitude.
Mm-hmm.
Introverts perhaps need more solitude to find their energy. So, how do we sort of, what does healthy solitude look like compared to the isolating kind that signals maybe emotional danger?
Hmm. I like the differentiation again. Healthy solitude. And as those who walk the Jesus path, Jesus often took time
Mm,
in solitude to reflect, commune with the Father, right? To reassess and re-envision the mission. And so healthy solitude can be intentional and create space for the purpose of
mm,
enriching ourselves and growing for the purpose of being healthy while connected to community.
mm.
Unhealthy solitude is the opposite. It's about avoidance and it's about
Uh,
disconnection.
mm-hmm. Hmm. That's super helpful, I think, as we all maybe do some assessing of our own lives, right? Like,
Mm,
okay. Now, for someone, Grace, who maybe is realizing, maybe in this moment, maybe in life, whatever, you know what, they're realizing I'm pulling away
mm,
from community, from honesty, maybe even from faith. What maybe small first step could begin to reverse that isolation plot line starting to happen in their lives?
mm, mm. Well, first, it will start with some form of self-awareness,
Mm,
right? And that could happen internally, looking up and realizing, wait a minute, it's been a while since dot dot
mm,
dot I connected with or heard from or was engaged in whatever activity. It could often be externally motivated, you
mm.
know. Hopefully you also have community that may reach out to you after they've noticed,
Right.
hey, I haven't seen you in a while or we haven't
Mm-hmm.
heard from you in a while. And so there's some sort of self-awareness that indicates, something has to change. And then that moves into the desire to reconnect and reunite because you can
Mm.
be made aware that you've been dipping out on
Right.
engagements, but do nothing to change that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so starts with self-awareness and then comes with the desire to reconnect and reunite. And then you got to do it.
Yeah.
You can't just stay
Yeah.
there thinking about it.
Mm.
You got to do it. Reach
Yeah,
out, book a coffee date, live into that new intention.
yeah, and I'm thinking that, for some, particularly if you add something like depression on top of it, or, maybe there's something else going on there too, that can be incredibly difficult, right? The push to make that drive to
Mm,
connect, right? Like that's not always
mm,
easy.
mm,
But again, the tragic plot line, it's interesting because the rest of them, they sort of call us to something, right? Whereas tragedy is simply one of those plot lines it's just a warning.
mm,
It's a
mm,
warning. Hey, this is where you're headed, and here are some of the warning signs. And so, this is valuable, I think, for us as humans to be able to reflect on this plot line and ask ourselves, where am I headed? Where am I going? And, I keep thinking of words from Jesus. He says, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. And there's something interesting to me about that because it's an
Mm-hmm.
invitation out of tragedy, not to a perfect life, but it's a direction. Come, start moving in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder at times if maybe the first step to avoiding tragedy is to stop pretending there's no problem at all. Stop
Right.
pretending the boat isn't sinking, and at least point ourselves in the right direction. So if anyone listening today feels like their life has been drifting towards isolation or pride or despair, there's still time. That's the key with the tragic plot line. There's still time for us to move our story away from tragedy into a better storyline.
Mm-hmm. I like that. I like, reflecting on the words of Jesus. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened.
Mm.
There's no if here. He
Mm-hmm,
already
right.
knows we are tired. You are
Yes.
burdened. Come, right? No, so
You're
he's
right.
already speaking it into it, and to try to be in denial about that increases the risk of more tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes,
Yeah.
beautiful, Brad. I love how you bring your wisdom into this cautionary tale, as well as the hope that we absolutely have the power to turn this tragedy
Mm.
into something with meaning.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
that's tragedy for today, friends. Thanks to our Sacred Sofa listeners. We'd love for you to join us next time for our final plotline of the story,
Mm.
Rebirth.
Aha. To that next. Thanks, Grace, for all your wisdom as well, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.